Boy, you can smell that pizza all the way out in the amphitheater. Thank you very much, and thanks for being here today. I know it's a busy week, but we're delighted to have our special guest here. I'm going to abuse your goodwill for 10 seconds, and just to reassure our guests of how bipartisan we are, I wanted to mention a couple of upcoming events which we just got confirmation on, because I'd like to invite everyone in this room to join us. The first is 1 week from next Wednesday. We'll be here in this room with the Assistant Secretary of State, Roberta Jacobson, who is in charge of all Latin America issues, has been nominated to be ambassador to Mexico. She's going to come take us inside the negotiations with Cuba on the normalization of relations, and it's really a cool opportunity for students in this school. So I encourage you to put that on your calendar, Wednesday the 26th at noon. Finally, to reassure our good friend from Washington that how truly bipartisan we are, we have a Batten parent coming to speak on Friday, November 13th, who's a former colleague of yours. Former Majority Leader Eric Cantor will be with us to address the Batten School on the Republican economic agenda for the 2016 presidential elections. I understand that Leader Cantor is working with the Bush campaign, but will give us a pretty good analysis of all the other campaigns, and you'll hear more about that later. Today, we're very fortunate to have the leader, the dean of Virginia's federal delegation, the United States Congress, a dean, another dean. Careful, people will come to you about getting their grades changed. You're our dean. And in one case, we have he is the former boss of one of our students who had the good fortune to work in Mr. Scott's office. And as a school of leadership, we're really very grateful to have someone who has been a leader on so many issues for the Commonwealth. In Richmond, where he did double duty in the General Assembly and the State Senate, and in Washington, where he has been a leader and a strong and passionate voice for many of the issues which you students work on from all different political perspectives. Criminal justice reform, education, labor rights, and minimum wage, just to name a few. I would also highlight the Congressman's strong views on drone policy and on the Patriot Act, where he has taken strong positions and articulated them very clearly. With Virginia's loss of seniority in 2014, a massive loss of seniority with Mr. Wolf and Mr. Moran retiring and Mr. Cantor departing, the Congressman, along with Mr. Gillette from our neighborhood, is the veteran of our delegation on the Hill. And one of the things we learned last week when our class was on Capitol Hill, Congressman, is that people repeatedly said from the Republican side of the aisle, when I have an issue in criminal justice reform or ed and workforce, or as we used to call it, ed and labor, I go check with Bobby Scott because I want to get educated on what different folks in the state are thinking, and we really have a bipartisan delegation, at least to discuss some stuff. I get a sense you guys vote differently a lot, but we appreciated hearing that. Very briefly, the Congressman attended a residential liberal arts college in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And after Harvard, he earned his law degree at Boston College, and he served our nation in the armed forces during the Vietnam years. We're delighted to welcome him here for what we hope will be the first of many visits to the Batten School. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Bobby Scott.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here. See Chelsea again. Hi, Chelsea. It's, you know, I was asked to just talk a little bit about some of the things we're doing in Washington and then respond to questions. So let me just take about 15 minutes to talk about some of the issues that we're dealing with in Washington and how just a thought process or lack of thought process goes on in many of the issues. Now, we just heard about the budget and economic plans. That is one of the problems, major problems in Washington today, where the normal process is you pass a budget sometime April and May, and then pass either tax bills and or appropriations bills to match the budget in time for the October 1st new fiscal year. We got to October 1st, we hadn't done, I don't think we'd passed a single appropriations bill by October 1st, and so government was about to get shut down, and we extended the process on what's called a continuing resolution, authorizing agencies to continue spending at the rate they were spending, no new projects, until December 11th. And when a 2-month extension becomes cause to celebrate, you know how bad things have gotten. One of the problems is that the demagoguery about the budget has been so outrageous. You have people running on platforms that I'm going to cut your taxes, I'm going to raise defense spending, and the most important issue to address is balancing the budget. And then you get elected on that platform, people expect you to deliver, and obviously fundamental principles of arithmetic prevent you from doing it. And so you're ducking and dodging and equivocating and trying to pass things that don't add up. The Republican budget, in fact, had a $4 trillion hole in it. They said that with all these cuts, we'll also cut taxes, $4 trillion, budget neutral. Well, if $4 trillion in tax cuts are budget neutral, that means they got to raise $4 trillion in taxes to make it budget neutral, or virtually eliminate government as we know it to cut down to $4 trillion to be able to pay for the tax cuts. Nothing was done. There's just an asterisk in the budget, and it passed. Well, when you can pass a budget that way with all these kind of asterisks and assumptions, but when you get to an appropriations bill where you put numbers on line items, they're not going to add up, and that's the problem we're in now. The appropriations numbers are so low that nobody wants to be associated with a budget with numbers that low, and well, let's just kick it down the road 2 months and deal with it then. This process, the budget process and balancing the budget is not that difficult, but you have to make some hard choices. One of the first votes that I cast, we're just joking about when you first get there. One of the first votes I cast was on the Clinton budget in 1993. It was a tough budget. It raised some taxes. It cut some spending. After 8 years of that budget, we were at a point where Chairman Greenspan was being peppered with questions in early 2001. Are we paying off the national debt too quickly? What will happen when there are no government bonds? Because investment strategy is no risk government bonds. If you have higher risk, you have higher expected rate of return. How do you do investment strategy with no government bonds out there? What's going to happen to long-term mortgage rates when there are no government bonds? Those are the questions that he was dealt with, because at the rate we were going, we were going to pay off the entire debt held by the public by 2008. We would put all the money back in the trust funds by 2 years ago. That was the direction we were going in. We passed major tax cuts in 2001, 2003, started fighting 2 wars, not paid for, tax cuts not paid for, prescriptive drug, $500 billion prescriptive drug plan not paid for, and all of a sudden we're back in the ditch. The idea that tax cuts do not affect the budget is Republican doctrine. It is so, in fact, it's in the rules. The rules of the House provide that if you have a new spending plan, you have to show how you're going to pay for it. Either cut another plan or new taxes to pay for it. If you have a tax cut, you do not have to pay for it, as if it doesn't affect the budget. In fact, the Republicans this year alone have passed about $1 trillion in tax cuts without paying for them. And the Senate hadn't taken most of them up. But, I mean, that's the problem with all this demagoguery. You can touch your taxes, raise spending, and we're going to balance the budget. And that's where we are. It gets a little bipartisan from time to time. About 2.5 years ago, with the so-called cliff deal, we're going to go over the cliff unless we did something. Well, the cliff deal was extending $3.9 trillion in tax cuts from the Bush era, $3.9 trillion. And if we hadn't gone over the cliff, the budget, if we had gone over the cliff, and let the taxes reset to where they were, we'd have been in line to get back on track to being very close to getting a budget balanced in a couple of years. But we got all together, everybody paraded around, bipartisan. We passed the tax cuts, and we're still in the ditch. It reminds me of a story they used to tell about Ed Willie, who was the very conservative chair of the Senate Finance Committee when I was in the state Senate. Very conservative, so conservative that people hated him. Word was you couldn't get a dime out of him with a crowbar. Well, he walked into a bar right before an election, and he heard the people mumbling, oh, they go Ed Willie, nobody here going to vote for Ed Willie, can't get a dime out of him with a crowbar. And he lifted up his beer and turned to the bartender and said, bartender, when Ed Willie drinks, everybody drinks. People couldn't believe it. They started cheering, jolly good fella, jolly good fella. Oh, why are you talking bad about Ed Willie? He's got every vote in here, set up the house like that. Oh, they were just cheering. After a few minutes, he took a couple of dollars out of his pocket, put it on the bar and said, bartender. Everybody looked up. Bartender, when Ed Willie pays, everybody pays. Everybody was prancing around after we passed that tax cuts. Oh, look what happens when we work bipartisan. Oh, look at us, aren't we something? Within a couple of weeks, we were increasing the interest on student loans to try to pay for the $3.9 trillion. We were in a budget trap where we couldn't pass the appropriations bills because there wasn't enough money. And that's where we are today. Nobody's being serious about the budget. Nobody's putting line items on the page. Nobody, in fact, is showing the choices that are being made. For example, we increased the exemption on the estate tax. Dead multimillionaires used to pay an estate tax after the first $2 million they leave behind, $2 million. We put it up to 7, and now it's at 10. Going from 2 million a couple start to pay tax to you don't pay tax until you're leaving behind 10 million a couple, costs $388 million, billion dollars, $388 billion over 10 years. That is more, spending more on that than Hillary Clinton's debt-free college plan. Okay, let's have a choice. We can have a debt-free college for all the students, or the top 2% of Americans can get tax relief when they leave multi-millions behind to the next generation. Who wants to make the choice for the dead multimillionaires? Well, we already did. Now we're trying to figure out how to pay for it, and we don't have any money for these various college plans. Anything we do in education is going to depend on the budget. We're trying to fund early childhood education. Everybody has agreed that that's a very valuable investment long-term for our society. There's no money for fully funded. I think about 5% of Head Start students have access to early Head Start. Elementary and secondary, Title I, low-income areas don't get nearly enough money to deal with the challenges they have in dealing with education. Higher education, Pell Grants, interest on student loans, support for colleges. I don't have to tell anybody in here how expensive college is. Used to be that a Pell Grant would cover about 70% of your college education. You could work a little part-time job during the summer and part-time during the school year and come out of college debt-free. You heard people work their way through college. That's what they meant, about 20 hours a week during the school year and a summer job. That's enough to work your way through college with a Pell Grant. Now Pell pays, what, about a third or less of the college education? Used to be states would be paying about 2/3 of the cost. The student would have about a third. Now the states are paying about 1/3 or less. So without inflation, the cost has doubled. All of this is going on when we are sitting up worried about whether or not dead multimillionaires are going to be paying taxes at 2 million or 10 million. Those are the kinds of questions that are being raised. One of the choices that we have making, and I've been involved in, I'm not on the Judiciary Committee now, but I was for 20 years, choices in criminal justice. You can put money in early prevention, early intervention, rehabilitation. or you can codify slogans and sound bites. 3 strikes and you're out, mandatory minimum sentences, get it to rhyme, it's even better. If you do the adult crime, you do the adult time. Those 3 little slogans have 2 things in common. They're good vote-getting sound bites. They do nothing to reduce crime, and they load up to the prisons to the point where recent research is showing that we lock up so many people, 5% of the population, 25% of the world's prisoners. So we lock up so many, #1 in the world, that our incarceration rate is actually counterproductive. You got so many children being raised without their parents because they're sitting up in prison. You got so many people with felony records, can't find jobs. You're wasting so much money that you're actually adding to crime, not reducing crime. And that's where we are now, and the solution is more slogans and sound bites, or do what 30 states have done, cut out the nonsense, use research and evidence, and put your money where it makes some difference. And 30 states have, in the last few years, reduced their incarceration as they reduce crime. So they're reducing crime and saving money in the process, not wasting a lot of money on foolishness. Now, there are several bills pending that follow this. The one that Jim Sensenbrenner and I have introduced, the Safe Justice Act, is a comprehensive, evidence-based approach, starting with prevention and early intervention, diversion before trial, so you're not unnecessarily detained waiting for trial, drug courts and other things that divert people into rehabilitation to deal with the underlying problem, eliminate most of the mandatory minimums and let the judges impose sentences that make some sense. Prison reform, if you go to prison, you ought to be less likely to commit a crime when you get out, not more likely. So more rehabilitation in the prisons. Even parole reform, once you get a probation, once you get out and you're on probation, if you skip a meeting with your probation officer, a lot of times you get reincarcerated. Well, if you'd finally found a job in an apartment and they toss you back in jail for 3 months, what happens in 3 months? You lose your job, you lose your apartment, you come back out 3 months later as a felon looking for a job, as a homeless felon looking for a job, and you're back in the revolving door. Well, the Safe Justice Act deals with that. It saves a lot of money, and it pays for itself. A lot of it has police training and body cameras in there are paid for because of the massive savings by reducing mandatory minimums. There's a body camera bill in the Senate that costs $100 million. It hadn't gone anywhere because they can't find $100 million. In our bill, the Attorney General is authorized to take the prison savings and pay for things in the bill. They can pay for the body cameras, they can pay for the more drug courts, they can pay for prevention and early intervention programs, they can pay for second chance programs to help felons find a job. All of that is going on in our bill. There's another bill. There are still many members of Congress that love mandatory minimums, and they see the Safe Justice Act as a threat to their beloved mandatory minimums and other slogans and sound bites. And they have introduced a bill that we're evaluating now, but it looks as though it will have virtually make no difference on overall mass incarceration. And they're going to use that as criminal justice reform to try to defeat the Safe Justice Act, and we'll just have to see. That drama will probably play out some next week in the Senate, maybe in the House. But let me just stop there and go to questions. I said I'd talk about 10 to 15 minutes. I think I've done that, and answer questions so we can deal with some of the issues that that you'd like to deal with. Yes, sir. Well, of course, that's on the other side of the aisle. I would say if they go into total confusion, Democrats are members of the House, and we do have a vote. Usually it doesn't make any difference if the majority, if you're in the minority, the majority is picking the speaker, usually it doesn't make any difference. But if they can't pick one on their own, we might help them. Pick one of theirs, they get a few Republican votes, and, you know, I think under the circumstances, it'd probably have to be a Republican, but there are a lot of Republicans who are, they have what they call the Tea Party caucus and what they call the governing caucus. A bunch of people think governing makes some sense and shutting down the government and things like that don't make sense. We can pick one out of the governing caucus and actually have a governing, a working majority. Back during the Reagan eras, Reagan always had a a Democratic House. But there are about 30 or 40 or 50, what they call them bold weevils back then, call them blue dogs today, would always vote with the Republicans. And so he had, although Democrats had a numerical majority, Reagan had a working majority of the House. And we may create that if they can't get themselves together, but you would expect Paul Ryan can get a majority vote. John Klein, who is chair of the Education Committee and is not running for re-election, might be an attractive candidate because if they make a mistake, he's gone next year anyway. They got to pick somebody. Well, they don't really have to pick anybody because Speaker Boehner said he'd stick around until they elect a speaker, and there's speculation that he ought not sell his local condo. He might be around for a little while. In terms of what it does, Boehner indicated that he wanted the Safe Justice Act to come to a vote. And I think if you look at the bipartisan support we have, we've got liberal organizations like the NAACP and ACLU, you've got conservative spokesmen like Newt Gingrich and Grover Norquist, the Koch brothers, all saying nice things about the Safe Justice Act. I was on a panel the other day listening to the guy rail on and on about what a good bill it was. Turns out he was a former president of the NRA. And so you've got a broad coalition, so if we feel we can get it to a vote, it can pass. Now, some of the leaders have problems, so they love the mandatory minimums and they don't want to let loose. So just procedurally, I don't know what's going to happen. Chavez from Utah is a strong supporter of the prison reform provisions in the Safe Justice Act. We'd look to him for leadership. But my expectation is if it's not Ryan or maybe Klein, that the others that are running would have trouble putting together the 218 on the floor. Look for Boehner to stick around if it's not one of those two.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. My name is Ann Jordan, and I am a second-year MPP candidate in Professor Wilbur's class, and I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. And just talking about the Safe Justice Act and how broad a coalition it has, how do you see that coalition forming? Were there like advocates within Congress that were really bringing people together? Is it public sentiment? The right time?
Well, I think it's the right time. I think one of the things that's happened is governors, even in red states, have noticed that they're wasting a lot of money on prisons, and it's taking up so much of their budget. If you look at California, I don't remember the exact numbers, but California used to spend about a third as much on prisons as they do on higher education, and now they're spending a whole lot more on prisons than higher education. How'd that happen? Higher education flat, prisons going up, and if they can get the prison money back down, maybe they can invest in colleges. Texas, I think, was the most striking example. Their budget committees were hearing projections that they needed within the next couple of years, $2 billion in new prison construction, and somebody suggested, well, if you try to spend a couple of $100 million rather than $2 billion, you might not have to spend all of the $2 billion. Well, they did. Strategically invested in prevention, early intervention, rehabilitation, and they were so successful that they didn't have to spend any of the $2 billion. In fact, they were able to close some of the prisons they had. Now, the conservatives look at that as, you know how much tax cuts you can do with $2 billion? liberals were saying, you know how good that is for humanity and justice? And rather than discuss why we're supporting it, we just support it, and we'll have our press releases later. But 30 states have saved money in prisons and reduced crime in the process. And if you use the savings for crime reduction, you can reduce crime even more. And so you've got people like Grover Norquist, the anti-tax guy, who notices that you're just wasting the taxpayers' money. You've got others that just see the system is just too not just. And we can all get together. And one of the things that Jim Sensenbrenner, Republican from Wisconsin, and I have tried to impress on people is that everything in the bill has some reasonable basis for being there based on either research, evidence, state experience, a logical expectation that if it's in there, it's going to reduce crime and save money. That is in stark contrast to the way most criminal justice policy is made. You take a political poll, and if it scores well, that's the end of the research. 3 strikes and you're out was the #1 best vote-getting slogan of the 1994 election cycle. I asked somebody, how many people get busted on a 3rd strike, serve, get out, and commit another crime? They're still looking. They haven't found one yet. And so whatever was being given before the 3rd strike law went into effect was clearly sufficient. By keeping these guys 80 years old, 80, 90 years old, can't get up and down the cell block without their walker, spending all that money on them, thinking you're doing anything about crime in the street is absurd. But that's what we're doing, and trying to get an evidence-based approach has been extremely helpful because it gives us kind of a rhetorical high ground over the slogans and sound bites that have been so prevalent. But most of the people just showed up. The people that are sick and tired of wasting money. There's an old adage, a liberal is a conservative that got arrested. Some of these conservatives have been arrested, and all of a sudden, of course, a conservative is a liberal victim of crime. Anyway, a lot of the conservatives have gotten caught up in the system and have noticed Bernie Kerik, who was, I think, police commissioner in New York, got busted for something, served time in jail, and all of a sudden, he just has seen from the inside how counterproductive, waste of money and counterproductive all that is, and he's been involved in prison reform. Some others have been in prison, others have been caught up in the criminal justice system and seen how unfair it is and would like to make some changes. Some just like the savings. Some don't like the idea that girlfriends are getting on these mandatory minimums. If your boyfriend is selling drugs and you get busted and you drove them to a drug deal or took a message on the phone, you are part of the conspiracy. Okay, you're guilty. The judge looks up on the matrix. You get, the sentence is based on the weight of the drugs. Well, if he's selling a ton of crack, you get like you're in a ton of crack conspiracy, and there you go with 20 years. It is not unusual. Well, to show you how bad it is, you've got the president has a commutation plan where he will consider for commutation to time served or almost time served, a significant reduction, anybody who has served 10 years and they are a low-level, nonviolent, essentially first offender. He will consider them for commutation. Now, that sounds like a reasonable plan, but it ought to occur to you, how did a low-level, nonviolent first offender get 10 years to begin with? Because they got these mandatory minimums. And these people have served 10 years, at least 10 years, and have so much more time to serve that they need the president to come and rescue them. That's how bad it is. There are tens of thousands of people caught up in these things, and a lot of people see that's just fundamentally unfair. So you got a lot of people for a lot of different reasons supporting the Safe Justice Act, and I think if we can just get it to a vote. We've got 25, we introduced it with 11 Democrats and 11 Republicans. Jim Sensenbrenner loves it when there's an absolutely equal number. There are a lot of more Democrats who would like to sign on, but he won't let them become official co-sponsors unless they either bring a Republican or there's enough Republicans to make room. And we're up to 25. I think there are a couple that we haven't signed on yet because we've been out of session. So I think we're at least to 50 now, co-sponsors, equally divided. And if anybody that's watched what's going on in Congress, for any substantial piece of legislation, bipartisan means 80 Democrats and 2 Republicans, or 90 Republicans and 2 Democrats, bipartisan. To have 25 and 25 is just off the chart. I mean, I don't think there's anything meaningful legislation that has that kind of support. So we're optimistic, but the other bill, the only threat we have is the other bill that purports to be criminal justice reform that will sabotage our ability to do anything about mandatory minimums. Yes, sir.
Congressman, thank you so much for being here. My name is Mark White. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Mark White. I'm a second-year MPP graduate student, and I'm from all over, but have lived in Virginia for quite a while. A lot of folks have talked about December 11th as being sort of the big budget date that we need to worry about. But this morning we have a report from the Treasury saying that we're going to hit the debt limit on November 3rd now. I'm wondering if you could offer any sort of forecast, I guess, of how you think that debate might go and what sort of the possibilities of ensuring we don't default on our debts are.
You're right. The debt ceiling comes up, and another little cliff we might run over is the transportation bill, where we have been doing short-term transportation bills, 3-month extensions, 3, 4, 5-month extensions for the last 2 or 3 years. Try to plan a transportation plan for Virginia on a 3-month budget. You know, you can't get the environmental studies. Environmental impact statement takes a year or 2. So, I mean, you can't do anything. And so nothing intelligent is getting done when we're on that. We need a 6-year plan, and that's right in the middle of it. It's all, the question is whether we will govern or whether the Republican leadership in the House adheres to what they call the Hastert Rule. They don't want anything to hit the floor that doesn't have a majority of the majority. Now, unfortunately, that means it's going to be so conservative that it can't pass the Senate. So you're not governing if you adhere to the Hastert Rule. On the other hand, if you have virtually all the Democrats and a third of the Republicans, you've got way over 218 votes you need, and you can pass a bipartisan bill that can get through the Senate. That was Boehner's problem. If he wanted to keep a seat, he couldn't govern. If he governed, they'd toss him out. And he just got tired of it. And he'd sat behind the Pope for an hour. It's not going to get any better than this. He doesn't, you know, he doesn't need the aggravation. So it depends on whoever is speaker. Now, if Boehner's speaker, he'll govern. I mean, at this point, he doesn't care. I'll point out to you, we extended the government, stayed open till December 11th on a vote that included, I believe, every Democrat and 40% of the Republicans. 60% voted no. That is essentially to shut down the government because there wasn't any alternative. So we just wait for the Republicans to decide whether they're going to govern. Now, there are allegations that there are only about 40 or 50 crazies in the Republican Party gumming up the works. Well, whether or not that's all there is or not, the fact is 60% are voting with them. And so that's what we're dealing with. And so, you know, if you have, and they had a debate, Republican against Republican debate on Meet the Press, where Dave Bratt from Virginia and Charlie Dent from Pennsylvania, a moderate, were arguing about whether you're going to govern or not. Charlie's caucus may have, they've got at least 40, because that many, I think, signed a discharge petition, which just ignites, I mean, it just gives the other party power on the Import-Export Bank. We're going to pass that because they've discharged the committee, brought it to the floor, and it has to be brought to the floor. So you got at least 40 will sign a discharge petition. When we're in the majority, I mean, the speaker would, if you want to serve on a committee, you will know better than to sign a discharge petition. So, I mean, they have a fractured caucus. If that many will sign a discharge petition to eliminate the rules, to bypass the rules committee and everybody else. 40, they've got 29, anything over 29, the Democrats, unanimous Democratic caucus, and 29 of theirs get you to 218. They have about 40. And so if that caucus is willing to keep the government open, we're in good shape, at least on a piecemeal continuing resolution basis. But you've got the transportation bill. Some of us have stopped voting for short-term extensions. I've concluded that you'll never get a 6-year plan until you stop passing 3-month plans. Of course, that little philosophy can get you in trouble because the last time we had a 3-month extension, they decorated it with some good stuff for veterans, some funding for VA programs. So after it passed, with me voting no, first call we got was, what's up with your vote against the veterans? I said, well, you can't win. But the transportation, the debt ceiling, and keeping government open are all dependent upon the 40 or so Republicans voting with the Democrats to govern. That assumes that the Speaker will bring the legislation up for a vote. That's where discharge petitions can come in. But we just have to see, and it depends on who they elect as Speaker. If they elect Paul Ryan, I think he wants to govern. I think Klein would want to govern. But he's got the same arithmetic problem that Boehner had. If you govern, they're gonna toss you out. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Wells Baylor. I'm from Richmond, Virginia. I was wondering what you think the greatest challenge is towards your district in particular.
Are you talking about the redistricting thing that's in court? Well, the suit was filed alleging that the 3rd Congressional District is an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. The case so far has been successful. The judge threw it out and is ordering that the district be redrawn. In terms of threat to my district, to me, I'll just point out that I did not appeal the decision. All the Republicans in the delegation got together and appealed the decision. Okay. I don't know what the law is. They change it since the Voting Rights Act, they've changed the law every 10 years. And so if you draw the lines based on 10 years ago, it's probably going to be in trouble this time. And so you're just guessing, but you do the best you can. The court has alleged that if you have race as a predominant factor in the drawing of the lines, that's subject to what's called strict scrutiny. You can do it, but you have to pass strict scrutiny. It's a 2-part test. One, you have to have a compelling state interest to do it, and your remedy has to be narrowly tailored to address that interest. The 3rd district was 53% black. They moved it up to 56% black. They're not doing me any favors because that essentially makes the adjoining districts more Republican. When I was first elected, I was surrounded by 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Now I'm surrounded by 4 Republicans because of what they call overpacking the 3rd district. That extra 3%, the court said, 1, it's a racial gerrymander, and 2, what is your compelling state interest? They said, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act says you can't dilute a minority district. And the court's response was, okay, that might have explained 53, but not 56. You're done. Okay, the problem that occurs, they could have fixed it, just a little tinkering, and then passed a new bill. The only problem is, since they passed it, the Republican governor has been replaced by a Democratic governor who would have to sign the bill. McAuliffe isn't signing a bill that's going to create in a state that Obama carried twice and has 2 Democratic U.S. senators and governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general, all Democrats. McAuliffe isn't going to sign a bill that locks in 8 Republicans and 3 Democrats. At the last election, none of the elections were close. That's what you can do with gerrymandering. And so they can't pass a bill just to bring it down to 53 and be finished. They gave up. The courts are doing it. And now the question is, what is the maximum African-American population in the 3rd District? Well, there's another little interesting thing. The Shelby case essentially abolished Section 5. It says you can't dilute. Virginia is no longer under Section 5 because they've tossed it out. And so you can't have a compelling state interest to draw it at 53 because that's a Section 5 that's no longer there. There is Section 2 that says that if you can draw a minority district, if you can draw a district in which a minority community can elect a candidate of their choice, you have to draw it. At what threshold can the minority community elect a candidate of its choice? It's always been kind of, you get this idea of majority, minority district. The guy that's been appointed the special master to draw the lines 15 years ago wrote a law review article that essentially said that the idea of majority and minority is absurd. You have to do a locally analyzed study to see what that is there. Some places, 51% isn't enough. Some areas, 60% isn't enough. And if you're doing Hispanic districts, I mean, you get citizenship thrown in, 70% may not be enough. You have to do it locally, that's local assessment. Jennifer McClellan, an African-American in Richmond, said that her district was 46% black, and they moved it up to 55. At 46, she and all other Democrats, black and white, candidates of choice in the African-American community were running about 70%, 65, 70% or more in her district at 46. So 46 was obviously more than enough in that area. So that's why I said the House of Delegates district's a toast. It's just a matter of time. They're going to get tossed. But what is the threshold? Is it 46? The governor's submission suggested that the threshold may be as low as the mid-30s. 40 is about as high as you can actually justify. Some of the others want to keep it up majority-minority. When that decision is made, then we'll know what's going on. Because if you can draw it at if you have to draw it no more than, say, 40, which for me personally is a whole lot better than what I had when I was in the General Assembly for 15 years. That district then was about 33. So 40 is a lot better than I had. If you draw it at 40, I'm not affected, but 16% African American come out of the district and they don't disappear. They got to land somewhere. And that's why the Republicans are scurrying around trying to appeal, because they don't want to have to draw lines where that 16% is distributed somewhere. The 4th district in the governor's plan is about 48% African American, which would mean that the current incumbent would not bother to run, Republican, Randy Forbes. You could put Bratt in a district that he can't win. You can put Ridgel in a district he can't win easily with those kind of numbers. So I don't know how it's going to end up, but frankly, I'm not concerned. There's somebody in the back. Way in the back. Yeah.
My name is Henry Clark, and I'm a second in Chicago, Illinois. Most of my and all the other students' life here has been characterized by massive government deficits.
Massive what?
Massive government deficits. Given that Chinese investors and other foreign investors seem likely to continue purchasing U.S. debt, how do you respond to the claim that the endless gridlock, debate, and eventual shutdowns are worse for the United States than having a deficit?
Well, I mean, those aren't the only two choices. The third choice is get serious about the budget and pass something. I mean, we're not having serious discussions. I mean, the first thing about this serious discussion is you start using arithmetic, not philosophy, numbers. And you hear stuff like you have to cut entitlements. Well, what's the number? Most of the number on cutting Social Security is what they call chain CPI, essentially cut the cost of living increase. You get about $125 billion over 10 years cutting Social Security using the chain CPI, $125 billion. Going from 7 million to 10 million in the estate tax exemption, if you just scale it back to 7, so you start paying tax at 7, that gets you 135. The Cliff deal was supposed to protect tax cuts up to the first $250,000 of your income. We went up to 450. That's 200. So let's make, I'd like to use whole sentences. You have to cut Social Security is not a whole sentence. A whole sentence is you have to cut Social Security in order to protect tax cuts for the wealthy. Now, if you don't want, if you're not interested in, if you're willing to scale it back to $250,000 where you get your tax cuts and not over that, if you're willing to drop the estate tax to 7, if you treat capital gains and dividends as regular income, that gets you $1 trillion. I mean, make some choices, put some numbers on the table and make some choices. I've told people, you get people talking about 1-to-1. We got about, if you got $100 billion worth of budget deficit reduction, it ought to be 1-to-1. 50 billion in tax increases, 50 billion in spending cuts. We're going to do it 1-to-1. And when they say, well, we can only get 25 billion in tax increases. And so the other side says, well, we only do 25 billion in spending cuts. No! Arithmetic means you got to do 75. I mean, you get people thinking that if one side goes down, the other side goes down. No, that's not arithmetic. Arithmetic is one side goes down, the other side has to go up if you're trying to meet $100 billion. So we're not having, I mean, we're not even having serious discussions. We can do this. We've done it. We've shown in '93 we were on track to paying off the entire debt held by the public. In 13 and beginning of 13, when we passed the Cliff deal, we passed $3.9 trillion in taxes without paying for it. We had a $1.2 trillion sequester that everybody's scared of. We could have done a 2.7 in tax cuts, taking care of the sequester. A couple other things, the Medicare challenges and a couple other things, little quirks, alternative minimum tax quirk in the code. Could have taken care of all those and had maybe $1 trillion left over for tax cuts. No, we did all 3.9, and now we're trying to figure out what to do with it. When people say they're not going to raise taxes, Dave Bratt on Meet the Press said that in 11 years, at the rate we're going, we'll only have enough money for entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the national debt. Entitlements and interest on the national debt. That's all we'll have money for. Okay, I agree with them. That's arithmetic. Then what do you do about it? You don't cut taxes. I mean, you make a choice if you're going to fund the rest of the government. Either you cut entitlements or you raise taxes. And I'll tell you, you let me put the taxes out there and let people make a choice. We can reduce the amount of exemption on the estate tax. We can cut the taxes to $250,000. We can treat capital gains and dividends like regular income. There's a quirk in the code that gives a tax preference to bond financing rather than equity financing. If a corporation sells stock and gets money, they pay dividends, they make their little money, pay taxes, and then pay dividends. If you raise the money selling bonds, you make your money and pay interest on the bonds with tax-deductible money. Why is there a tax preference for bonds? Well, if you make it equal, that's a couple of trillion. Okay, I've just put $3 or $4 trillion on the table, and the budget crunch we're in right now, the difference between Democrats and Republicans is about $30 billion. I put a couple of trillion on the table that I think people would go for before they started throwing kids out of Head Start and some of the other things that are going to be, or raising interest on the student loans. The reason we can raise interest on student loans and make a profit on it, we ought to be subsidizing the loans, not making a profit on it, is students don't vote. When y'all start voting, you know, maybe we can help with the College Promise Act, 2 years free college that the president has recommended, or debt-free college, or Bernie Sanders is about $700 billion, free college, all state colleges free, which is not in kind of the universal idea, not unheard of, but a lot of countries around the world have free college anyway. If you can get into college, you just go. Just like high school has become, you go to high school, you don't have to pay for high school. You get to high school, it's free. The high school diploma back then is what the equivalent. You need a college degree to have as much employability firepower as a high school diploma gave you back then. So why isn't college free? Because we're so busy funding $700 billion. Capital gains and dividends is regular income. You can do free college, all $700 billion. You know, nobody's making the choices. So when we start making the choices, we can get the job done. When you hide behind, I'm going to cut you. Donald Trump he gives everybody a tax cut, and they scored at $12 trillion in the next 10 years. I mean, you know, and is anybody challenging him on it? I mean, he says, they'll call it Oprah Winfrey tax cut. You get a tax cut, you get a tax cut, you get a tax cut. And then you look up, everybody's getting a tax cut, everybody's smiling, they look up, yeah, I'm in an income bracket, I got a tax cut. And then nobody notices the bottom line is $12 trillion. Well, if he can campaign on that without being ridiculed, and he's not being ridiculed on it, and so, I mean, the politician, that's your platform, what's the problem? The problem is when you get to the crunch we're in now, you got a big deficit, and nobody's seriously doing anything about it. Now, I forgot to say on the '93 budget, when we created 20 million jobs, we eliminated the deficit, went into a balanced budget and surplus, and we're on the way to paying off the national debt. The 218th vote cast was Marjorie Margolis Basinski, who was not applauded for her vote, but they started a chant on the Republican side. She was a freshman, cast the 218th vote. Bye-bye Marjorie. And they defeated her in the next election, along with about 60 other Democrats who had voted for the budget, creating the first Republican majority in half a century. That's what happens when you vote for a responsible budget. So until the people start demanding some common sense in it, you're going to get everybody get a tax cut and then worry about it later. But we can do this. We know how to do it. It's been done. And when we get serious, we'll get to it. But as long as the voters let people get away with, I'm going to cut your taxes as a first order of business when we got a budget deficit, I think don't blame the politicians for taking advantage of it.
I'm going to suggest we take two last questions, just because I know a few of you at 1 o'clock, and the Congressman has an appointment here on grounds, which may or may not involve food. Depending on what Tom's eating. But let's see if we can get two last questions.
Well, you pick them.
I saw these two hands first. Let's go start with TJ. Put me on the spot.
Yeah, that's right.
Congressman Scott, first off, thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Terry Mason. I'm from New Kent, Virginia, so adjacent to your district. My brother actually lives in Charles City. I'm a second-year Master of Public Policy student here. And so the recent crisis as far as like mass shootings within the United States obviously is a problem. But beyond that, this is an issue that disproportionately affects individuals within your district from Richmond, Virginia, all the way to Newport News. So I was curious where this issue as far as like gun reform legislation is on your agenda and what you consider your responsibility as far as moving forward on these efforts.
I'm one of the several co-chairs on the House Gun Safety Task Force. We came up with several recommendations, which included the assault weapons ban, the limit the size of magazines to 10 bullets rather than unlimited, mental health services, background checks, and prevention and early intervention investments. The task force has about 60 members. No Republican has joined. Unless you have any Republican support in a Republican majority House, nothing is going anywhere. So we are where we are. The recommendations are there. The bills have been introduced and are pending, and the Republican leadership won't take them up. I don't know what can be done if you have 100% unanimous opposition to anything, even things that the NRA, like background checks, had supported in the past. I don't see how you can hope for much progress until the voters start saying something.
All right. Thank you so much again for being here. I just want to go back to your question from, I think, Kevin, about arithmetic and the budget deficits. So this morning, or maybe it was yesterday, Medicare came out saying that premiums for Part B are going to go up by about 50%, about $100 per month to about $168. That's obviously, you could interpret as a tax cut, tax increase rather, on a large portion of seniors. And my personal concern is that Democrats are not going to use the arithmetic and instead try to find an override for it or even draw from the contingency funds, which just in the long term would further deteriorate the financial condition of the program. So my question for you specifically is, going back to the idea of arithmetic and balanced budgets, finding the cut of the payoffs, how would you deal with this problem in particular? And then with Medicare financing on long term, what are you looking at to keep the program sustainable?
Well, you just put numbers on the page. How much does it cost? How much we're spending? You know, what is the cost? And then how are you going to get the money? And if you're not going to come up with the money, then you cut the programs. The $100 increase, Medicare recipients pay a percentage of the cost, and as costs go up, they pay the same percentage. If you're going to reduce the percentage they pay, then you have to come up with the money, which means tax increase. You can get rid of the $100. That's easy if you get the money from somewhere else. If you can't get it from anywhere else, then you're stuck with the $100. It is interesting that also today, that I thought I heard the report say that those states that had expanded Medicaid actually saved money on Medicaid because the federal government was paying 100%. A lot of the uncompensated care cost shifting was being picked up by the federal government, not by the Medicaid and private sector. So those states were much better off. Virginia has not expanded Medicaid. 400,000 people are unable to get insurance. 30,000 jobs could be created. The general fund for the first couple of years would save about $100 million a year because people that go to MCV Hospital and don't pay, you give them a Medicaid card, they pay with federal money, which is money the general fund didn't have, added up about $100 million. And to add insult to injury, unless we expand Medicaid, rural hospitals are not going to be able to survive because the Medicare funding formula on uncompensated care assumed that everybody would be getting Medicaid and there'd be less indigent care. If you don't have those people coming in with Medicaid cards, your kids coming in, those hospitals are going to be in deep jeopardy. And also, to add more insult to injury, everybody's paying. Now, I have been unable to get from Medicaid exactly how much your parents are paying per person every month because 400,000 people show up at the hospital, don't pay, so when you go, you got to pay a little extra. It's at least $10 a month a person, and maybe as much as $20 or $30 a month that you are now paying. And if you're an employer with 1,000 employees, that's like $10,000 to $20,000 a month that you're paying every month because the guys wouldn't take the free money. So, there's a lot of stuff going on in healthcare that doesn't make a lot of sense. But we usually try to coordinate Medicare cost increases with Social Security increases. Where it is Social Security beneficiaries are not going to get anything. And so if Medicare goes up, everybody's a lot worse off than they were, which is a problem that we would want to deal with. At least have people no worse off next year than they were this year. But the challenge is going to be, where are you going to get the money? How much is it? You're talking billions of dollars. What are you going to cut? Or whose taxes are you going to raise to come up with the money? Or you just let it slide on. The easiest thing to do is just cancel it and let it slide on into the deficit. That's how we got into the mess we're in now. Because we're not, addressing the fact that if we're going to deal with the deficit, you got to raise taxes or cut spending. We did it once, and we lost about 60 seats in the House of Representatives. Democrats lost 60 seats. I don't know how many people want to try that again, doing the right thing, especially since the public isn't demanding it. I've seen nobody out here saying raise my taxes, other than Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett would make a lot of money if we raise taxes and increase spending, improving the economy. He would make a lot more on his stock portfolio than he pays in extra taxes, because he's got more of an interest in the stock market than he does on the marginal income tax rate, as most people making more than $250,000 have much more of an interest in the performance of their stocks than they do on the 1 or 2% on their income. But you just have to be serious about it. And when people start demanding arithmetic, and just listen to the discussion. I mean, there's no choice. Nobody said, you hear anybody say, when we talked about cutting taxes, how are we going to pay for it? Or do you hear anybody associate the increase in student loan interest rate with the tax cuts that had passed a couple of months before? I mean, people act like they're unrelated. When people start addressing the arithmetic, then I think you'll have the appropriate outrage, and we can do something about it.
I think you've heard very clearly an explanation of why we proposed that you study arithmetic. Ideology. It's a wonderful setup, Congressman, for the simulation we're going to run next week. We're going to simulate your discussions on December 11th, and I think our mantra for liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, at least in my classroom, should be arithmetic, not ideology. But we hope very much to have the Congressman back on grounds. We hope this is the first of many visits to the Batten School. And in order to ensure that and increase the likelihood, we want to make sure you get some lunch. So please join us.